Hello, thank you all for coming. My name is Jay Blazek Crossley. I do program development and research at Houston Tomorrow. We're a charitable nonprofit dedicated to improving the quality of life in the Houston region. And this is our distinguished speaker series, which is funded by the Anchorage Foundation. So thank you to the Anchorage Foundation. And a major focus for us for improving the quality of life in this region is to work for policies that will allow people to have a low-carbon lifestyle, to have more choices on how we live in the Houston region. And a major influence on that work has been Professor Peter Newman. And so we were extremely excited to have the opportunity to bring him here. He is a professor of sustainability at Curtin University in Australia. And he has published several books, which we have copies here. And I think I will just hand it over to him. And thank you for coming.
Well, thank you to Houston. I've got to start saying it properly. Thank you to Houston Tomorrow and for everyone coming along tonight. I've been on a tour with these two books, and Tim Beatley, the co-author on both books, is coming to Houston sometime in the next month. I'm not quite sure what for, but
February 16th.
What is it?
February 16th, the Rice University.
Okay. Well, I'll sign the book for Green Urbanism and Down Under, but you've got to get him to sign it as well, especially that book, because that's one he's done a lot of good work on. Now, I've been to Vancouver, Seattle, Los Angeles, Denver, Boulder, New York, Washington, and now Houston, and if they'll let me in, tomorrow I'm in Atlanta. And I'll go back to Washington to meet with some of the new administration, which I'm looking forward to greatly, because it's a wonderful time. And I did, when first planning this tour, try to have some events in Washington on the 20th of January. Couldn't work out why it wasn't working. I got bumped off the agenda. It was a fabulous time to go there, and I was just talking to a few people here about it, and a time of great hope, not just for America, but for the whole world. We had a meeting at the UN Consul where the count was being displayed, and there were about 400 people came along, and we had our own little vote, even though we couldn't vote. 4 people voted for McCain, which was an interesting result. That the response when the Pennsylvania vote came in, the consul, who was trying to be very remote and say, oh, we're not political and all this, he actually broke down at that point because he realised that Obama was going to win. And that sense of change now being feasible and possible is what we are trying to say in our books about cities. And there is still a way to go, I think, to think about what we do in our cities and responding to these issues. I come from the Swan River Colony. The Swan River Colony was where the black swan was first seen. The Black Swan is a book now about unpredictability. And black swans were first seen in Perth in 1698 by Blaming, who was amazed because up until then swans were only white. And so this idea that somehow the past doesn't always tell you about what is coming, what is possible, is the idea that Nassim Nicholas Taleb is writing about. And black swans can be bad or they can be good. They can be about fear or hope. And we have 3 unwanted black swans, climate change, peak oil and the crash, which perhaps could have been predicted, but our books are about how we respond to these things in our cities. That's Tim there on the right. We have a website which has got a whole lot of material, extra material on it, resilientcitiesbook.org, including a section I wrote on the theology of cities, having an interest in theology, and Island Press took it out. But the other day I was on Wisconsin Public Radio, and the person interviewing us was most interested in that section, talking about Zion and Babylon and the different cities of the future. And so there's other bits you can read on that website. Climate change is with us, and we don't need to talk any more about it because it's a reality and it's happening, and in this part of the world you know about it. It does impact on cities. The interesting thing is to see that around the world now we are committed to a 50 to 80% less greenhouse gases by 2050. Obama's committed to 80% less by 2050. Most of the world has signed on to that. Australia and America hung out till the last. A year ago we had our Obama change, and climate change was the main election issue. There was no crash around at the time. I think it probably would have been bumped off, but the climate change did change the government, and John Howard was put out of office because of that. And the very first thing that our Prime Minister and Cabinet did was to sign Kyoto. So the politics of the world has changed, and it will very rapidly change here now, as you see that this is serious, that we are no longer talking about whether it really is happening and all that sort of thing. It is now how you do it. And in Copenhagen this year, the next major global treaty will be signed, which will lead the way to how countries are going to do this. Just imagine you yourself having to phase out 50 to 80% of your fossil fuel use. Not straightforward, is it? So we've got a few things to learn in the process, and what we do in our cities, particularly in a city like Houston. But peak oil is something that has occupied my attention for a long time. It's quite simply that we're reaching the limit to the number of barrels of crude oil that can be pumped every day. That was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And you are oil people, you know all about oil fields, they come and go. And in countries, oil comes and goes. In the US, it began to go in 1970 and it's been going down ever since. It's now 87% depleted. There are very few policies that will, well, there is no policy that will really reverse that. You can stretch out a little bit more here and there. But that was predicted in 1956, that 1970 would be the peak. And this man, N. King Hubbert, who was a US Geological Survey geologist, said that that would happen. I met him when I was at Stanford in 1973. It was a very traumatic time when the first oil crisis hit. And he said, look, this is just a skirmish. The big time will be in the early part of the 21st century when world oil will peak. And he has been proven right because discoveries have been diminishing, and all of these countries have been through their peaks and are going down. Our best estimate is that 2010, 2015, that kind of period is where the geological peak will happen. But in reality, it actually hit us last year, or this past year, when this sudden increase occurred. So this era of cheap oil, which is when most of Houston was built, is over. How do we now face a future where the possibility of this happening and then going down is upon us? Two quick studies that have come out since our book was written. In the UK, a study has now shown that the 5 big oil companies peaked in their oil production in 2004. Now they can go anywhere in the world. why have they peaked in production? And this report says the key response is going to be the volatility in prices. It's going to go up and down, and you now have a situation where Stephen Chu, the new energy advisor, is saying we must put a floor price in to keep a steady factor on oil. Volatility is a big issue, but underlying it is a growth in the price of oil of 6% per year, and permanent decline is setting in. The World Energy Outlook is the International Energy Association's report, and over the last 20 years they have been very cynical about peak oil. This year they basically said, oh, sorry, we got it wrong, it is running out, and it is declining faster than previously thought. In fact, 9% per year looks like the decline rate, unless there's massive investment, which would take it to 6%. We would have to find Saudi Arabia every 2 years. But in reality, what happened in the last year is what is informing our book. The global crash has been caused by car-dependent subprime mortgages. Not all subprime mortgages fell over. It's only those areas where people were so car-dependent, and as the fuel prices tripled, that pushed them over. They couldn't afford to pay their mortgages anymore because they had to drive to work, and it was costing so much. Banks were loaning excessively on the belief that car-based growth would always happen, and that's ended. So we are in a situation now where the oil-based future, confidence in that is undermined by that sudden rise, and then the sudden fall, which we're now in, has undermined all the alternatives, because the alternatives are all at least $80 to $100 a barrel, and suddenly many of those projects are falling over. So great uncertainty, and the most serious impact is on these areas that are being abandoned. Some of these suburbs that are boarded up, that are no longer able to be lived in because they are so far away. And I call it urban scatter. It's even worse than urban sprawl, which we've done mostly in the last 50 years, is spreading cities out. But when you scatter it around in the outlying areas without any regard to services, employment, or public transport, then you have a problem. So we now are faced with a crash. We have this sense of dread. How is it going to affect us personally? What's it going to do to our communities and our children? What's it going to do to our cities? There's a lot of fear. How do we become resilient? There are, for the first time, studies which are showing declines in vehicle miles travelled, declines in containers, declines in aviation, anything that is dependent on cheap fuel. Does that mean declines in our cities? How do we respond? Our book looks at 4 scenarios: collapse, ruralised city, divided city, and resilient city. You have a banker in Houston, Matthew Simmons, who is very well known around the world in the peak oil scene, because he's written a book about Saudi Arabia, about our responses to peak oil. He says the unforeseen consequences are devastating. Roscoe Bartlett says civilization is going to end soon. There are very strong statements, and if you read websites on this, if you look at dieoff.com or lifeafterthecrash.com, you'll get very depressed. It is entirely feasible that collapse can happen because cities have collapsed in the past. This is Ephesus, which was the second biggest city in the Roman Empire. It collapsed because the port that it was based on is now 8 miles inland because the surrounding forests were cut and the river silted up. Same in Babylon, the great city in the ancient world, collapsed in 140 BC. Cities do die. Jared Diamond's written a book about it, collapse. But he also talks about those cities that changed, adapted and survived. And that is about awareness, and it is increasing very rapidly. I've seen dramatic increases in awareness over climate change. Peak oil is a little less so, but it is growing. Now, if your response is, well, we only know white swans, they're the only ones that can exist, then cities will decline. And some cities are going to do better than others. Ruralised city is the response that says the only thing we can really do is grow our own food. Now, it's a bit of a difficult one to analyse, because for many environmentalists that is a part of the solution. And for Matthew Simmons, for example, he says, what should we do? Start growing our own food. And some people like the urban scatter because there's more land out there and therefore more food production possibilities from that. We resolve this by saying localised food production will increase. There will be reductions in food miles, slow food movements and so on. But cities will remain as cities. Havana is taken as an example because it produces 40% of its own food now, since they had the oil cut off down there when the Russians stopped providing them. And but it is still a city. It is not a city devoted to food production. It is a city devoted to creating economic opportunities that you can't have in rural areas. So green urbanism for us means that cities are more urban and more green at the same time. Divided city is where you get wealthy eco-enclaves surrounded by Mad Max suburbs. Now, Mad Max was an Australian contribution, 3 crazy movies, but they were about peak oil and they were pretty scary. We are seeing this happening. The eco-enclaves are emerging. Many of the central and inner areas are becoming very wealthy. Lots of public transport, you can walk to everything, lots of healthy food around, and they are becoming places of preferred living. It's better than having them in decline, but if a city becomes more and more like that, and they become divided, where the poor are further and further out, then it undermines the whole city. I was in Century City in Los Angeles the other day, looked down on this development. It looked like a new urbanist development. I thought, this looks interesting, I'll go and have a walk around. But you can't get in, there's an armed guard on the gate. All of these responses are based on fear. And fear is never the basis of good policy. And it is a wonderful thing to now talk about hope. So the resilient city is about hope. It is a city based on that, and it is trying to say that we need to create a new economy in our cities, which is more resilient. It does mean we need to discover some black swans. It's not entirely clear what we're going to do. But we can be confident that the old city can be rebuilt. The innovation cycles that have happened in the past have been about black swans. The first industrial revolution cities were built around ports where water power and iron were developed and mechanisation happened. Then steam power came along and railroads spread the cities out. Then electricity, tramways, electric railroads, the first cars, but they didn't change the cities much until the second phase, where petrochemicals, and the era we've just been in, of oil, of freeways, of cars, have shaped our cities, have spread them out around the world. Some cities done more than others. And that era is ending. the digital era has come in the last 20 or 30 years and has changed our cities. It has helped us to recreate central and inner areas. Instead of being old manufacturing kinds of industries, they have become the knowledge centres, the service centres based around digital technology. But the new technologies are relating to sustainability, radical resource productivity, 80% reductions in fossil fuels. That will be the defining nature of our new technologies. Whole system designed by mimicry, green chemistry, industrial ecology, renewable energy, green nanotechnology. These are all emerging as part of this green economy. It's what Obama talks about, it's what Stephen Chu and his advisors are now going to implement. And there will be programs coming out of your ears as they start to say, please show us how to do it. We will give the money and we want you to do it quickly. We'll be part of the response to the crash. And that is very typical of history in cities, because at each of these transition points there was a downturn. The 1840s was a depression, 1890s a depression, 1930s a depression. And out of it came the new technology. Out of it came the new kind of city. They did not go back. So it's very important that we see this time as a transition period. And the stimulus cannot be to go back to building what we've done in the previous economy. Our resilient city outlines these cities: the renewable energy city, the carbon neutral city, the distributed city, which is about small scale distributed infrastructure, photosynthetic city with green roofs and green walls and linking into the biodiversity and open space, the eco-efficient city, which is the factor 4, factor 10, the 80% reduction type of city, place-based city, which is where we have identity and belonging and local orientation in what we do, and the sustainable transport city, which is mostly what I deal with. And when Tim comes in February, he'll tell you a lot more about these ones. But let me just outline what I see as being the key issues in sustainable transport. There are two things we've got to do. One is to stop things, and another one is to start building. And the Blue Dog Democrats, as they're called, are saying we've got to save money in this present situation. Don't just throw money for the sake of it. Some things we need to stop, and I agree entirely. Coming in here today, I saw some of the most expensive roadworks I have ever seen. $100 million per mile to build most of those systems. There is no shortage of money in this city when you can do that. You could have built sustainable transport rail systems for at a quarter of that price per mile, and they would have had 20 times the capacity. The fact is, they were the defining technologies of that era. You've done it more than anyone, probably, but you have to stop. It's no longer going to help create a future city for you. And there's an enormous amount of money to be saved there. And you've got to put that into building this new kind of city, the electric renewable city, with much greater localism in the economy and infrastructure. This is the green economics where we need to spend. Who has to change most? Well, fortunately, you're not the worst in the world. But you're the second worst. Atlanta is. Atlanta has 103 gigajoules per person of fuel. It's extraordinary how much more it is, and Houston is 84. The other US cities are around the 50 mark. The Australian, Canadian, New Zealand cities are around 35. All European cities are less than 20. Barcelona down here is 8. 8 gigajoules compared to 103. Similar levels of wealth, is it necessary? And Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, also wealthy cities, less than that, 5 to 8 gigajoules, and all the new cities of China and India less than 2. Now there is a fear around about Chinese cities. They're going to take over the world because they're taking our oil and they're using cars and they are consuming the world. Well, I did some numbers. 200 million Chinese have moved into cities in the last decade or so. Dramatic change. They are not using as much fuel as one Atlanta. And density is a big thing. Density is something we've constantly shown to be related to this. Barcelona here has 200 people per hectare. All the European cities are around 50 people per hectare. Our cities are less than 20, but Atlanta and Houston's down there at about 8, and Atlanta is 6 people per hectare. Because of the outer lying scatter. That's what really brings the densities down. Now you've got areas of this city and Atlanta that are quite dense, but they tend to be all over the place. They are not focused. And one of the things we'll talk about is how to make sure that the transit system and the focused centres work together. But it's very hard to understand much you can do for places like this. These are the vulnerable places. And we will need to work some things out. You can't just abandon them. And Barcelona will go on without much change. But we can't change Houston into Barcelona. But we can perhaps learn that that parts of the city can be like Barcelona. And they can be quite attractive, just as Barcelona is. We will have to be very careful not to build any more of this kind of scatter where we don't have any services and they are really vulnerable. We're looking similarly in Australia. This is Sydney. See that blue area there? That's the very wealthy part of Sydney. They use cars 10 times less than the red areas out here. 10 times less. You see the factor 20 there, 2.3. This is really walkable, totally transit oriented, and that's now the most attractive part of Australia to live. The interesting thing is these lines of green through here, which are about halfway between those, and that's the rail lines. The rail lines do change the nature of the city. They do provide an option that we can do. So the big politics in Australian cities now is how to build rail out to those suburbs. And it's expensive. A new body has been set up called Infrastructure Australia, which I'm a board member of, and we have $20 billion to distribute to these kind of projects to try and help adapt our cities to this new era. But the most important thing to do is to stop building the freeways. You can see Houston and Atlanta here. It's very clear that if you build it, they will come. And I've got some wonderful additional photos to add to this collection of mine across US cities. These don't look nearly as good as yours do. And you've got stars on them. The Century Freeway here, this interchange in Los Angeles, is about the size of a medieval city. So you do take up a lot of space, but the problem is they actually don't help much. If you look at Texas Transportation Institute data, which looks at miles of freeway and delay, there should be a correlation there. The more freeway, the less the delay. Not so, it doesn't relate. So it's all over the place. And it actually doesn't change the city much. And the reason is that cities adapt to the 1 hour travel time. No matter what city you live in, the average travel time budget is 1 hour. whether it's Bangkok or Brisbane or Houston, and it adapts to the infrastructure you provide. So if you build freeways, they just spread further out and you still adapt to that travel time. But freeways don't do well as public spaces, and they will be dinosaurs in the future. Good, all kinds of things you can do with them, and we'll come to that. And what we are now seeing is that they don't do much good for cities. They probably are quite good between cities in terms of movement of freight, rather than rumbling through the countryside and villages and so on. But they don't help cities much. What can we do with something like this? Future archaeologists will wonder what they are for. But that space could be replaced by one railway in terms of capacity, because a freeway can only carry, one lane of freeway can carry 2,500 people per hour maximum. A busway can double that. A light rail can go up to 20,000, a train, a heavy rail can do 50,000. So 20 times the capacity. And you can see why essentially all of those drivers can fit into 3 buses or 1 tram. And all of that space is then saved. Space is money, space is less greenhouse gases, space is a more walkable urban environment. And we did a study for PB, Parsons Brinckerhoff, which looks at the costs of urban sprawl. So it's not just the cost of building those structures, but what happens on the urban fringe to actually build those new developments, and how does that compare to redevelopment? And we've been talking this afternoon to a series of developers looking at TODs, transit-oriented developments, things like these developments here that follow train lines. And that's what we compared. What were the two differences in cost? And we found that the fringe is subsidised by about $85,000 per block in terms of infrastructure, and it costs an extra $250,000 over 50 years in transport, and a lot more greenhouse gases, as well as health costs. So you can save money if you change the city. There are also a lot of human issues. In the UK they did a study which looked at the difference between kids who are driven to school and the kids who walk or take a bus to school. And they talked about the battery hen kids who lose a sense of belonging and a sense of place. They develop a great suspicion about their local area. Fear dominates. And they then don't take risks as much. They don't develop the ability to make decisions. And that is an issue that is partly associated with this car dependence. So our book is really asserting that to be more green, the city needs to be more urban, and it will be a better city. It will be a better place to live. To get there, we've got to do Todd, Pod, Bod, God, Bev, Eco, B, and TDM. Just so you can remember it easily. And we go through each of these in the book. Todd is transit-oriented development, and increasingly right across the US, this is now the policy of cities to try and make these TODs work. And this is what Houston Tomorrow is on about. Creating these activity centres. If you imagine here, this is the old walking city, these are the tram-based city, and around it are all the suburbs we've created. What do we do now? We need to build transit systems that go in and around the city and make centres all along those. The suburbs remain. You don't have to bulldoze the suburbs. You don't have to make a Barcelona out of it. You do, however, need to make centres. Focused centres on transit lines. That's what TOD is about. And Vancouver is a city that's had this as a policy for a decade now, and along their SkyTrain they've been making these kind of settlements. But you can see all of these areas, these are ordinary low density suburbs. The difference is they're right next to a train station now. and a place where there are services available and jobs and schools, childcare centres. So you've got other options. It's not just car dependent. And so these suburbs gain, and yet they've also got their space that they like. To build a transit system, it's got to be competitive with the car. And you can see down here the cities. Houston's right second at the end there, in terms of the speed of your transit system compared to the speed of traffic. Public transit is growing in the US, and it's growing dramatically in Australia, and it happened before the fuel crisis. Because younger people are moving back into the city, they don't particularly want to live in suburbs, and car dependence is not as cool as it was. So that process is happening. There is a demographic reality to that. Now we've set up this Infrastructure Australia in order to help fund these changes, because we haven't got enough space in our transit system anymore. It's just completely full. Denver has showed a similar pattern. I was there a few days ago. The fast track system, John Rennie, is he still here?
No, he's got to go to the airport.
He's off to the airport. He worked in Denver, and over the years they've put together this idea of fast tracks, which is going to change their city. It's a very sprawling, similar city to Houston, flat, goes on forever, has something less than 2% of all its trips on transit. And a group got together early on and said, we need to change this city and build these rail lines and TODs along them. It eventually got taken over by the Chamber of Commerce because it became something that they wanted to do in terms of the economic development of the city. This was their next phase. So they voted in a $5 billion package, which is now being increased to $7 billion, and they're building all of these tracks. And as they're being built, or even before they're being built, the TODs are coming in and are being built around them. There is a real demand for them. Washington DC is a great story. Now, I was there when the whole city was car-free for a day. It was a great celebration for me, not just for Obama, but it was just full of people walking down the streets. The metro system, which was designed to carry about 700,000 people, carried 1 million. It did feel like it too. But it was fantastic to see the way that worked. Now, in the 60s and 70s, when they built that, most transport planners said this was a complete waste of money. You really shouldn't be building this. You hear that frequently, but you can't run a city these days unless it's got a decent transit system. And Washington DC has now got one. The interesting thing is to compare it to Atlanta, because in the 60s, Atlanta and Washington DC were very similar cities in size and in transport characteristics. Washington DC built the metro, Atlanta didn't. It built MARTA, which is just a little inner city thing, and there's 18 counties of sprawl with no transit around it. But DC has now 86 stations, 106 miles, that carries 200 million people a year. It's a decent transit system, and you can live your life around it, and people do. And as soon as a new line goes in, the TODs are built very quickly around them. It is very popular. What's the result? DC has 50 gigajoules per person, Atlanta 103. Very different cities now in a 20-year period. That's a hopeful story, because any city can change. Even a city like Denver, which is similar to a city like Perth. Now this is Perth. This is my story. That's me in 1979, leading the Friends of the Railway, which was set up to try and save this train line, which the government closed down. 1979 was the second oil crisis. Not a great year to close a railway down. And there was a mass public reaction. It was the best thing they could have done because we got a huge political movement together that has borne fruit now. It's nearly 30 years. This year is the 30th. Oh, I must do a celebration. 30 years since that decision, and we have rebuilt our rail system to enable each corridor now to have a transit, an electric rail system that is faster than the traffic. It's taken a while. We won 5 elections on the basis of it, and it was very politically successful. So this last leg, which has just been opened, well, a year ago, had 90% approval ratings and was so popular that because we had a mining boom on and we were flush with funds, it was paid off. So there is no debt on this train. And that only happens when you have very strong political support. It's carrying actually 55,000 people a day. The buses that ran down that corridor only carried 14,000.